Good morning and welcome to ASL's HR in 10
at 10.
I'm Jason Perry.
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
And each week on a Thursday morning we talk about the goings on in HR to keep you up to date as to what you need to be aware of as an employer.
Yeah, never a dull day and so many topics to choose from each week.
Absolutely not. Well, last week we managed to talk quite a lot in depth about what's going on in Ukraine. And I kind of think it's still a little bit there, isn't it? It's wider than Ukraine. But for me, the big thing right now, Kimberly, still has to be the cost of living crisis. What's going on with our people and the effect it's having on their pocket and their ability to live, put food on the table and not feel a reduction in their wages.
Yes, I was interested by what the ONS reported actually, because is it a 1% pay reduction when adjusted for inflation?
Yes, in real terms, which is that lovely phrase governments always use, in real terms, by the time you adjust for any changes in inflation, the average person has a drop of 1% in their disposable income, in their take-home pay now.
Yes, I can't remember what the assessment period was that they used, because what's going through my head, and I'm no financial modeller or anything like that, but what's going through my head is we've seen so much about, vast salary increases to recruit people. Does that mean it's reduced after the salary increases or before?
Well, I think the thing you've got to factor in when looking at this is the breadth of everybody. We've heard about, and I think professional services was the big one, where we looked at things like top legal firms, top accounting firms. We're talking about pay rises upwards of 10% as a relatively normal thing to be expected this year. But what we don't think about is those firms that are struggling through the pandemic, those firms who actually are finding it tough and have burnt their reserves just to survive, and perhaps are now looking at it and saying, really sorry, there is no pay rise this year because we just don't have the money. Or firms that are operating on, the one that strikes me often is kind of healthcare contracts, things like childcare contracts. The contracts are often negotiated for, whether or not it's 12 months or 3-year rolling periods. And the fact that the cost of living has gone up doesn't mean their ability to charge their client a fee has gone up.
Well, likewise for charities, they're funded in particular ways, and just because, and often funding, certainly from places like the Arts Council, for example, is for 2-3 years.
Yes.
And so how are they going to afford to increase anything when they don't have any more money to play with?
Yes. So a lot of organisations are making long-term rolling plans as to how they finance themselves. And I think when you look at this real terms reduction of 1%, that's taking into account the companies that either put pay cuts through COVID and haven't been able to reverse them yet, and there are a few of those out there. You're talking about companies that haven't been able to do any pay rise at all, but you're also bringing in the small number. And I think, we can talk about these big pay rises as 12% in, let's say, the legal industry. But what we know is that's a small number of people compared to those working in the massive industries where people perhaps aren't seeing those increases.
Yes, and I think the issue going forward is that unemployment levels are really, really low, and yet what was the number of new job vacancies?
Well,
was it a new record?
Unemployment is at pre-pandemic levels. However, just a word of caution, and that's at 3.9%. Economic inactivity, i.e. working age people who choose not to be either in work or searching for work, is actually a little bit higher than it was. So there are some people who, for want of a better way of putting it, have opted out of employment, whether voluntarily or otherwise. But you're right, job vacancies has hit another record high at about 1.3 million vacancies. So we have a huge number of employers looking for people, struggling to find them, and somewhere scrabbling to attract people, often by putting pay rates up. And even in spite of that, we're seeing a real terms reduction.
Yes, interesting times. So on the figure of on the topic of figures and salaries, should we talk about the changes coming up in April?
Well, just before we do, there's a couple of bits I still think are worthy of talking on there, which we'll come back to in a sec. But the couple of things that struck me when I looked at this data is the point when real terms pay fell below inflation. Looks like, on the graph I was looking at, looks like it was July last year. Now that's quite interesting, and the two lines, it's one of those lovely graphs with lines all over the place, and yeah, absolutely. For those of you listening on podcast, you just can't see the hand gestures Kimberly's making to reflect a complex graph, but the lines crossed in July, August last year, where the effect of wages fell below the effect of both RPI and CPI inflation rates. And the gap has been getting bigger ever since. I mean, it's just a downward slide. Now, given we're expecting inflation this year to hit 7, 8%, perhaps 9% for a brief period, this is going to become more and more significant, and people are going to need to look at their people, particularly those on the lower wages. And what caught my attention was Currys. Currys have just given a 5.2% pay award, and this is the second one in 12 months to anyone who is hourly paid. So all of their hourly paid people are now on a minimum of £10, which is both above the national living wage and above the real living wage. And I think we're going to see more of that, Kimberly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. That's a good point to move on the 1st of April changes, I think, because perhaps we should start with the living wage.
Indeed, the national living wage will be going up to £9.50 from, I think it's £8.91 at the moment, isn't it? And that's for over 23-year-olds. Obviously, the figures are less if you're younger or an apprentice.
Yes, there's about another 5 layers of figures for different age gaps underneath, but the headline figure most people are interested in, as you say, is at £9.50. The real living wage, which you and I have talked about on here before, went up in November. It's interesting that they set it at a different time, but went up in November to £9.90. So, there's now only 40 pence between the two. That's also kind of interesting as the gap's closing.
Yes, it is. I mean, I think that's one of the lowest gaps we've ever seen.
Yeah.
I was just reflecting on what you said about the time that they announced it. I think, if I'm right, the announcement from the real living wage people came after the announcements of what the national statutory rates were going to be.
They also allow about 6 months for somebody to match it. So it was announced in November, and the employers had till May to match it. So, but Currys' move to go to £10, I think, is an interesting one. I think we're heading for a period where the living wage will not be a baseline. I think there will be many lower paid employers traditionally who will now be paying above those lines. So
what I'd be interested to see is how many companies are signing up to the real living wage.
Yes.
And making that commitment, because we've talked a lot about the challenges of employing people and attracting them to you.
Yes.
But that is, being one of those companies is a way of attracting. Indeed.
There's a couple of other changes going on pay. I mean, these feel very, very small, I have to say, looking at them. What do we call them? Family statutory pay. So everything from maternity pay, paternity pay, adoption. There's a range of them in there, aren't there? So all of those things are moving, and it feels very, very small to me, I have to say. It's going up from £151.97 to £156.66. So somewhere about £5 a week. I'm not really sure £5 a week cuts it in the current climate, but equally employers have to fund this somehow. So that's happening. I guess for most employers you need to be aware of this, but the reality is what's actually happening is it's done by your payroll process. If you've got a modern smart payroll system, you just need to be aware and check the changes are rolling through rather than know the numbers, don't you?
Absolutely, yes. Sorry, I was distracted slightly by a cat jumping over there.
They do that sort of thing. And likewise, SSP's changing. So
yes, but equally, people need to be aware of the fact that the COVID SSP specifically ends on the 17th of this month.
Which is today.
Today,
yes. So COVID SSP is now a thing of the past.
Exactly.
Today is the last day of it. And also you have to put your claim in to HMRC by, I think it's the 25th, if I recall correctly. So next week, you have to process your payroll at the beginning of next week and get your claim in for any COVID SSP. Otherwise, you will not be refunded.
Exactly. And then normal SSP, which is what will be the only option going forward, has gone up by about £3.
Again,
quite small.
£96.35 to £99.35. So no doubt there'll be many more of those questions to ministers asking them whether they could live on £99 a week, and I think we all know the answer. Yeah, that's coming again, and for many employers, that's paid for by the employer, and it's a question of finding the money for that, how it's dealt with, isn't it? So. Kimberly, I would say we're rapidly running out of time for HR.
We're over, I know we are.
For HR in 12 or HR in 13 or whatever, but just one last one I want to sneak in for the changes from beginning of April. Right to work checks are worthy of a mention, aren't they?
Yes, because that's going to be made possible permanently going forward. It's going to be a digital checking service, and that's going to make so much... it's going to be so much more time efficient for those of us that are used to meeting up with somebody, seeing a passport, their driving license, utility bills, taking a photograph, and
I'm smiling because although this comes in at the beginning of April, many of us aren't quite sure how it's going to work yet, are we?
Well, no, and no research that I've done has told me how we're going to get these codes from people. I'm sure there's somebody out there that does know, but my understanding is that new employees, you'll get a code and you'll be able to check them on this fancy smancy
wonderful new system service. Yes I'm expecting it to be quite like the checks for EU nationals who've applied to the right to remain in the UK. So I'm thinking it will be quite similar to that scheme. But the second bit is we're expecting accredited providers or certified providers to be available for checking. And I think the reality is, as an employer, you need to make sure you do your due diligence and your chosen partner is appropriately certified to do what you're looking for. But it's worth mentioning there's nothing to stop you doing manual checks. You're still allowed to look at that passport or the combination of the birth certificate and the NI document to verify that they have the right to work, aren't you?
You are. Sorry, I'm thinking of a funny story about a client that brought his in and nearly lost all of them, but we obviously haven't got time for that, but I'll tell you that another time.
We'll have to do that another day. But for now, I think this has been HR in about 14. So, Kimberly, as ever, thank you so much for joining me and working with us on this morning. And we will see you all same time next week.
Pleasure as always, Jason. Thank you. See you next week.
Thanks for watching.